Book 6 of the Nicomachean Ethics begins in this way. Since we have said previously that we must choose the intermediate condition, not the excess or the deficiency, and that the intermediate condition is, as correct reason says, let us now determine what it says. For in all the states of character we have mentioned, as well as in the others, there is a target that the person who has reason focuses on, and so tightens or relaxes. And there is a definition of the means which we say are between excess and deficiency because they accord with correct reason. To say this is admittedly true, but it is not at all clear. For in other pursuits directed by science, it is equally true that we must labor and be idle, neither too much nor too little, but the intermediate amount prescribed by correct reason. But knowing only this, we would know nothing more about, for instance, the medicines to be applied to the body, if we were told that we must apply the ones that medical science prescribes, and in the way that medical science prescribes them. That is why our account of the states of the soul, in the same way, must not only be true as far as it has gone, we must also determine what the correct reason is, that is to say, what its definition is. What its definition is. So evidently, Aristotle here is laying out what this book of the Nicomachean Ethics is about. In the immediately following sections 4 through 7, he says basically what you would expect him to say at this point. So he reviews where we've come to so far, reminding us that in the function argument, we said that there are these two large classes of human virtues, those concerning the rational part of the soul, and those concerning the part of the soul that responds to reason. And hitherto we've been discussing the second group, the virtues pertaining to the part of the soul that responds to reason. These are the virtues of character. Now that this discussion is complete, it's time to turn to the virtues concerning the rational part of the soul. These are the virtues of thought. However, sections 1 through 3 of chapter 1 that I just read seem to point to some larger need that this book is supposed to fulfill beyond merely completeness in the account of the virtues. It seems that there is a sense in which the account of the virtues of character itself has been incomplete. The virtues of character, of course, have been described as a mean or intermediate between two extremes. But above and beyond this, Aristotle refers to something else that the person focuses on, apparently besides or in addition to the mean. And this is what he calls the target. A target that the person who has reason focuses on and so tightens or relaxes. And this naturally raises the question, what is this target? Aristotle had spoken of the good as a kind of target back in Book 1, you might recall that. So we naturally think of that here. But is there a good above and beyond the particular mean or intermediate condition that the virtuous person aims at? Is there a good above and beyond the mean? If so, what is it and how are they related? Aristotle provides here an analogy with the practice of medicine to help clarify what he's getting at. He says that there's an intermediate condition in the practice of medicine and in all the crafts. However, knowing that we are to aim for this intermediate condition in the practice of medicine in the way the physician does would not tell us what medicines to apply to the body. To see what Aristotle might be getting at here, let's ask ourselves, what would be missing if I knew that I must apply medicines to the body that medical science provides, and as the medical scientist, the physician, provides them? Certainly, if I knew that, I wouldn't be left totally in the lurch because I could look to a medical doctor. But I would not be able to apply the medicine without assistance, assuming I'm not a doctor myself, because I lack the ability to reason as a medical doctor does. Aristotle suggests that my inability to reason is in large part due to the fact that I would not be able to discern the target that the person who has reason focuses on. Now, in the case of medicine, this target is obvious. It's the health of the body. And I know that. But do I? What is that? What is the health of the body? We all have a vague idea of what health is, but only the doctor really knows what it is in such a way as to produce it through the application of medicine. Only the doctor really knows what the medicines are for and how to adjust them so as to reach the target of good health. And it's a sense of adjustment that Aristotle seems to be referring to when he talks about and so tightens or relaxes. That is, the target enables the physician to tighten or relax the application of medicine. So by analogy, Aristotle is saying that reaching the mean or intermediate condition of virtue is a kind of adjustment of one's actions through reason that aims at some ethical target at which the virtue is supposed to achieve. So a kind of intermediate condition that one is adjusting one's action to meet, that aims at an ethical target. That's the added part. It's not just aiming at the intermediate condition, but it's also seeing the way in which this intermediate condition is somehow set by the target, which the virtue is supposed to achieve. This is what was missing from the previous account of the virtues of character. We know that we ought to strive for the intermediate state, but in order to be able to do that, to know what that intermediate state is, it now seems that Aristotle is saying we need to know what these virtues are for. What are the virtues for? That's the question that needs to be answered in order to know how to fix the intermediate state, to determine the intermediate state. You have to know what the virtues are for. And we naturally want to respond, of course, well, they're for the sake of happiness. We already established that, right? Yes, indeed. But now we're asking how precisely each of them contributes to happiness. And this is not merely a theoretical issue. This is a profoundly practical one. Aristotle seems to be saying in this opening passage that if I don't know what being brave or being temperate or being generous is aiming at, what it's good for, I won't be able to hit the mean in the first place, because keeping that target in mind is necessary for reasoning about how to adjust one's action or one's state to the intermediate state. The virtues, it will turn out, and as will become clear when he defines them in this book, which is the definition of correct reason that he's referring to in section 3 when he says, that is why our account of the states of the soul in the same way must not only be true as far as it has gone, we must also determine what the correct reason is. That is to say, what its definition is. In other words, we're going to define correct reason in this whole book. That's what we're going to do, define correct reason. And in order to do that, we're going to have to see how prudence, which up to now has been sort of the representative of correct reason in our discussion of virtues of character, we have to see how prudence relates to the other virtues, and in particular to wisdom, which is going to be the controlling virtue that controls prudence. So that's what we're going to be doing in this book. The virtues stand in a hierarchical relation for Aristotle, because the virtues of character ultimately target or aim at the perfection of the human being as a whole. And the pinnacle of human perfection is to be found in the attainment of the highest of all virtues, and that is wisdom. So that's what we're going to see in this book. In other words, all the virtues are contributors to the attainment of the state of the soul that is wisdom, or conditions that enable its attainment. This fact about wisdom is what the virtuous person knows the completely virtuous person. Of course, you can be partially virtuous, but the completely virtuous person knows that wisdom has this central role, and that such that all the other virtues are contributors to the attainment of the soul that is wisdom. They are conditions that enable its attainment, the attainment of wisdom. That's the fact about wisdom that the virtuous person, the completely virtuous person, knows and keeps in mind when he reasons about adjusting his actions and states to reach the intermediate condition, keeping that target of wisdom always in mind. The virtues of character, as we've already seen, are governed by prudence. Prudence, however, is a virtue of thought that is subordinate to wisdom. This relation between prudence, and thus the virtues of character, and wisdom is first laid out in Book 6. And that is why this book is the first to define the target that the virtuous life as a whole aims at, which determines the correctness of correct reason. So it makes correct reason correct, as if it is facilitating the achievement of this target, wisdom, in a way that the target of health, in the same way as the target of health determines which medicines are the correct one to apply to the body. Just as Aristotle places the rational part of the soul over the appetitive or animal-like part, so too does he divide the rational part of the soul into a lower and a higher part. So he says, sections 5 through 7 here. Previously, then, we said there are two parts of the soul, one that has reason and one non-rational. Now we should divide in the same way the part that has reason. Let us assume there are two parts that have reason. With one, we study beings whose principles do not admit of being otherwise than they are. And with the other, we study beings whose principles admit of being otherwise. For if the beings are of different kinds, the parts of the soul naturally suited to each of them are also of different kinds, since parts possess knowledge by being somehow similar and appropriate to their objects. Let us call one of these parts the scientific part, and the other the rationally calculating part. For deliberating is the same as rationally calculating, and no one deliberates about what cannot be otherwise. Hence, the rationally calculating part is one part of the soul that has reason. Hence, we should find the best state of the scientific part and the best state of the rationally calculating part. For this state is the virtue of each of them. Now, a thing's virtue is relative to its own proper function, and so we must consider the function of each part. So we have, recall the division before of the three parts of the soul, the nutritive, the appetitive, or animal-like part of the soul, then the rational part. So now we're taking just that rational part, and he's dividing this into the scientific and the rationally calculating. And what determines the differences between these two is that the scientific concerns the things that are necessary, we could say, that they cannot be other than they are. Whereas the rationally calculating concerns things that could be other than they are, and the philosophical term of art for this is that are contingent. So these are the objects. Necessary things and contingent things. Scientific part of the soul and the rationally calculating part of the soul, concerning necessary things and contingent things respectively. And when he talks about the best state of these two parts, ultimately this is going to be corresponding to wisdom and prudence. But there are a lot of little subdivisions that he places under each of these, little nuances or minor virtues that contribute or subdivisions of these. And so we'll look at those too. But that's a basic opposition in the rational part of the soul, the distinction between wisdom and prudence. In later philosophy, this would often be described in Immanuel Kant, for example, as the distinction between theoretical reason and practical reason. But in Aristotle, it's the distinction between wisdom and prudence, corresponding to the scientific and the rationally calculating part of the soul. So that's our picture. Of course, as he describes it here, it's initially unclear, nor does he initially rank these in any sort of hierarchy. He does, however, suggest that the target mentioned at the beginning of the chapter will be defined in relation to the best state of both of these parts. That is, there's a hint of like a ordering of these parts in terms of at least a best state of each. Okay, so in chapter 2, Aristotle's first order of business is to lay down the target that the virtues of thought aim at. And this target is the true. So, virtues of thought all have as their aim the true. So these virtues are defined teleologically. They aim not at the mean, as the virtues of character do, but they aim at the true. And we'll see how all of Aristotle's definitions of the various virtues of thought have two crucial components. So, two crucial components. There's that they grasp the truth in a particular domain, and in a way that is rationally justified. Got a little bit messy there because I didn't put it the way I wanted to originally, but virtue of thought aims at the true. There's these two component parts. First, it grasps the truth, but in a way that's rationally justified. For Aristotle, it seems it's not enough to possess virtue of thought merely to be procedurally correct. It's not enough to possess a virtue of thought merely to be procedurally correct. As we might say today, respect a judge or bureaucrat who at least followed correct procedure, even if the outcome was unjust or wrong. At least they followed the correct procedure. That's not Aristotle's view. We're also sometimes impressed by, say, a scientist who concocts an elaborate experiment that tests a hypothesis, even if the results are inconclusive. Not for Aristotle, it seems. It seems for Aristotle, you don't get virtue points for trying. You have to grasp the truth, actually succeed, and also in a way that's rationally justified. So the second one, it's not enough to possess a virtue merely to have true thoughts. These thoughts must have been arrived at through a rational and reliable process. That's what reason provides for Aristotle, a reliable process for arriving at the truth. So we see this standard of truth. He says, page 102, second sentence of section 2, as assertion and denial are to thought, so pursuit and avoidance are to desire. Now, virtue of character is a state that decides, and decision is a deliberative desire. If then the decision is excellent, reason must be true, and the desire correct, so that what reason asserts is what desire pursues. This then is thought and truth concerned with action. The thought concerned with study, not with action and production, has its good or bad state in being true or false. Truth is the function of whatever thinks. But the function of what thinks about action and truth is truth agreeing with correct desire. So, whether we're talking about merely theoretical speculation or whether we're talking about practical deliberation that issues in action, truth is the standard in both cases. In fact, both of these components are going to obtain, whether we're talking about the rationally calculating part of the soul and the virtues that belong more to that part, that are more practical and concerned with deliberation and deciding on an action, or whether we're talking about the more scientific or theoretical virtues of thought. In all cases, there's going to be a kind of truth involved. In the case of the more scientific or theoretical virtues, the truth is just straightforward truth. It's just having a true belief about the world or what have you, having a true hypothesis, grasping true principles, having true beliefs about the validity of an argument and so forth. In the case, though, of the practical part, again, it's going to involve truth. But the truth here is going to be something like having true desires, Aristotle says, having a correctness in one's reasoning about what the fine thing is to do. There's going to be truth in that domain as well. So it's truth regardless. Truth is the standard for all of the virtues of thought, whether we're talking about true desire or whether we're talking about true belief. That would be one way to summarize it. We already know from the analysis of action that Aristotle provided in Book 3 that decision is the principle. That is to say, the fundamental basis of an action. Decision itself, however, is based on desire and goal-directed reason. That's this second part. It's got to be rationally justified, and that it's not just a matter of having the true desire, but a true desire that's based upon goal-directed reason. All true action for Aristotle presupposes reason and requires reason, and therefore presupposes thought. Goal-directed thought is a genus of thought in general for Aristotle, and this includes two specific kinds of goal-directed thought. So we have goal-directed thought is divided into production and action. This is, for Aristotle, as maybe it isn't for us, this is a fundamental distinction between production and action. We might be liable to think of production as a kind of subset of action, but that's not Aristotle's view. These are the two fundamental species of the genus goal-directed thought, production and action. In section 5, he says, this is page 103, thought by itself moves nothing, but goal-directed thought concerned with action moves us. For this thought is also the principle of productive thought. For every producer in producing aims at some further goal, and the unqualified goal is not the product, which is only the qualified goal of some production and aims at some further goal. An unqualified goal is what we achieve in action, since acting well is the goal and desire is for the goal. That is why decision is either understanding combined with desire or desire combined with thought. And this is the sort of principle that a human being is. This analysis points to a hierarchical relationship between these two, and we can represent this just by an arrow, which indicates the idea that production leads to and is for the sake of action. Action is above production. Because only action can provide an unqualified goal. The goals of production ultimately are all ultimately qualified by the action that they're for the sake of. That's the qualification here that he has in mind, that this is for the sake of some kind of action. All production is a production of means, not the mean now, but means as in means to an end, means that enable actions. The action is what provides the goal, and hence the principle for the goal-directed thought that's involved in production. So, for example, the moon landing. The moon landing involved all kinds of production of rocket ships, for example. But the goal of that production was set by the action that they were trying to achieve, namely landing on the moon. That's a straightforward example of the relationship here that he has in mind. Finally, Aristotle concludes in this chapter that this kind of thought involves beings that admit of being otherwise. For decision involves, as we've seen in Book 3 again, decision involves deliberation. which is always about future things that may turn out one way or another. If the future were fixed, we couldn't deliberate about it. It would be absurd to even attempt to do so. Then in what sense does this kind of thought, goal-directed thought, aim at truth? In the case of production, the implicit answer seems to be that deliberation aims at the truth about what will actually, in a technical sense, accomplish the goal of perfecting the product and achieving the action down the road. For example, what rocket will actually get a man on the moon and return him safely to the Earth, as JFK stated the goal of the action as being. So that's truth at the aim of, in the sense of production, what will actually truly achieve this product that we're trying to achieve this action with. In the case of action, Aristotle speaks of truth agreeing with correct desire. And this sort of speaks to the idea of what's the worth of pursuing this project in the first place. So, America wants to go to the moon, one might say, in 1962 or something. Well, is that correct desire? Is that a correct desire? Should we want to do this? Is this something that it's actually prudent for us to try to achieve? And when he talks about truth agreeing with correct desire, this seems to imply that there's a truth about what desire should be for. As when we say, well, you should want to, as people said in the 60s, you should want to eliminate poverty in America, not go to the moon. Why are you wasting all this money on going to the moon rather than eliminating poverty? If you really knew what was good for the country, you would want to eliminate poverty rather than go to the moon. So that's the kind of idea of truth as it pertains to action. It's obviously more complex and difficult issue than production. Even in the case of rocket science, there's really difficult issues in the nature of the case in determining sort of what the correct desire is supposed to be. Not always, but in some cases, like in this case, for example, it's not always so complicated. So you may not want what you should want. You may not have the correct desire. Your desires may not be true in that sense. That's what Aristotle seems to be saying. There's a truth about correct desire, and this is what the prudent person reasons about. Okay. So this brings us to chapter 3. Having established that all thought aims at truth as its target, whether it's theoretical speculation or whether it's practical deliberation and rational calculation, all of it aims at truth. Next, Aristotle lays out the 5 main virtues of thought. And there will be, as we'll see later on, minor virtues that fit in here and there. But the 5 main virtues of thought are these. And presumably these 5 virtues are all going to represent different states of the soul that involve grasping the truth, thereby fulfilling the function of thought itself, which is always to grasp the truth. But these states of the soul, the virtues of thought, grasp the truth in different ways or different domains of truth. So these are scientific knowledge, craft or craft knowledge, prudence, understanding, and wisdom. These are the 5 virtues of thought: scientific knowledge, craft knowledge, prudence, understanding, and wisdom. The 5 virtues of thought. The 5 main virtues of thought, we should say. Our main task in the rest of the video will be to define what each of these 5 virtues are, or to examine Aristotle's definition of each of these, and to explain what they are, and why Aristotle draws the distinction between them that he does. So first, he discusses scientific knowledge, And we can just summarize here some of the things he says about this in chapter 3. These concern, as we've already seen, they concern things that are necessary or cannot be otherwise. Cannot be otherwise. The paradigm here would be mathematical, logical, and metaphysical knowledge. And in addition to being necessary, these objects are also going to be everlasting, eternal, we might say, indestructible, and also scientific knowledge is going to be teachable. And the flip side, these are logically reciprocal relations, learnable, teachable and learnable. And it's going to be demonstrable. Demonstrable knowledge. In fact, this kind of knowledge could be characterized best perhaps as involving demonstrations. And the demonstrations can be one of two kinds. They can be either induction or deduction. And the difference between these two is whether you go from particular cases to a general principle, or whether you go from a general principle to a particular. Good. And conveniently, that about covers it. And that's good because I ran out of board space. So again, scientific knowledge concerns things that cannot be otherwise. The paradigm would be for Aristotle, mathematical knowledge, logical knowledge, metaphysical knowledge, and the like. Part of the concomitants, we might say, of it being necessary, the objects of this knowledge being objects that are necessary, is that they are also everlasting or eternal. They're not generated. They're indestructible, and so forth. This is knowledge that is teachable or learnable. And he says, though, it's teachable or learnable from what's already known. That is, you learn it on the basis of something you already know, which is, for him, part of the concept of something being teachable. You can only teach something on the basis of some prior knowledge that a person already has. So you couldn't teach someone who is completely, perfectly ignorant. You can only teach someone based upon things that you already presume they know from what's already known. But that means something specific in his case, because he's thinking here about deduction and induction as demonstrations whereby someone can learn things. So in induction, from particular cases, you learn a general principle. So in my experience, from all the cases I've observed, all the data I've assembled, all men must die. Valar Morghulis, for all of you who prefer High Valyrian. But I've arrived at that principle on the basis of induction from particular cases that I've observed. And then you can go in the opposite direction, from deduction. From a general principle, you learn a particular truth. From the principle that all men must die, I deduce that I must die. So that moves in that direction. So in each case, I'm starting from something known and then I'm moving to something else. For Aristotle, then, scientific knowledge involves either an inductive or a deductive demonstration. The knowledge, in fact, seems to consist in the demonstration itself. It seems for Aristotle that it's really, we'll circle this, scientific knowledge really is, it seems for him, consists in demonstrations. That's what the knowledge is. It's knowing these demonstrations. And you can see there how this is a matter of knowing truth in a way that's wedded to rational, reliable forms of thought. It's not just believing items as tenets of a faith system or something like that. It's believing things on the basis of rational presentation of the thing. He calls this a demonstrative state when he defines it. Now, to know a demonstration, of course, one needs to know the principle as well. Either there's the major premise of the argument or is the conclusion of an inductive argument. But the emphasis here in scientific knowledge seems to be on the demonstrative state, as he says. So he defines it, section 4, page 104, chapter 3. Scientific knowledge, then, is a demonstrative state and has all the other features that in the Analytics, another work of his, we add to the definition. For one has scientific knowledge whenever one has the appropriate sort of confidence and knows the principles. For if one does not know them better than the conclusion, one will have scientific knowledge only coincidentally. There he's suggesting that scientific knowledge is deductive. And this is the way that, in fact, Aristotle's conception of science had been transmitted because of his other works on the philosophy of science through history. But he does earlier on, he suggests that it could be deductive or inductive as well. But it's a matter of connecting the principles in the demonstration. So that's scientific knowledge. Now next we have craft knowledge, and this is a state that's concerned with production. So he says in the definition, section 6, a craft then, as we have said, is a state involving true reason concerned with production. Lack of craft is the contrary state involving false reason and concerned with production. Both are concerned with what it admits of being otherwise. Here, Aristotle seems primarily concerned in contrasting production and action, again, and delimiting a specific virtue that belongs to each. Craft knowledge is technical know-how about how to produce a thing. Prudence, as we'll see next, is reasoning about how to achieve the intermediate and act rightly and finely. But both craft and prudence are contrasted with scientific knowledge in that, unlike scientific knowledge, they involve things that do not necessarily exist, that admit of being and not being. So he says, section 4, page 104, every craft is concerned with coming to be, and the exercise of the craft is the study of how something that admits of being and not being comes to be, something whose principle is in the producer and not in the product. So we might say here it's a question, the distinction between scientific knowledge and both craft knowledge and prudence is a question of the direction of fit that's involved in truth. So if truth is a matter, let's say, of fitting one's mind to the world so that those two match up and there's not a kind of dissonance between your mind and the world, then in the case of scientific knowledge, the direction of fit is that the world sort of is what it is because it's eternal, unchanging, necessary, and the mind has to conform itself to it. But when we're dealing with production and action, it's the direction of fit is the opposite. That I have some idea of the way I want the world to be, and I try to make the world fit that idea, whether that's in producing something or in acting generally. Okay. So next we have prudence. We immediately see that for Aristotle, prudence has a more general scope than craft knowledge. So he says, right at the beginning of the chapter 5, page 105, to grasp what prudence is, we should first study the sort of people we call prudent. It seems proper to a prudent person to be able to deliberate finely about things that are good and beneficial for himself, not about the restricted area, about what sorts of things are means to health and strength, for instance, but about what sorts of things are means to living well altogether. So the craftsman deals with, even like the doctor could be considered a craftsman here, who deals with producing health. And so they're concerned with that. But the prudent person is the person who's concerned with everything. What's good, but what's conducive to living well, period, not just in some specific restricted area. So the object of prudence, the target of prudence, is not any narrow or specific end, but what sorts of things are means to living well together. This doesn't mean, of course, that the prudent person isn't sometimes concerned with minutiae of one kind or another, but all such concern will be nested within a deliberative chain of means and reasoning that's anchored in an overall deliberation about the general means for living well with other people. Note that it's not only the content of the prudent person's reasoning that is the fine, that is, they're concerned with reasoning about the fine, what the fine thing to do would be, but it's also the form of the person's reasoning. The prudent person is a person who deliberates finely, meaning that he doesn't allow base thoughts to enter into his reasoning. The prudent person has a certain characteristic way of thinking about things that is itself fine. For example, a prudent person isn't going to, first of all, suspect the worst of a person or give priority to maximizing his own narrow self-interest. Although our English word prudent unfortunately came to have that connotation. That was after our culture got taken over by capitalism, which is why many translators today prefer to use some other word, because prudent came to mean, being good at maximizing your own profit or something like that. And that's not what Aristotle means, just in fact quite the opposite. If that would be a base way of thinking, then the prudent person would not think that way. The prudent person is kind of an innocent lamb in one sense. That's overstating it, but just to drive home the point, the prudent person has a kind of pure way of thinking as well for Aristotle, a noble way of thinking, more exactly. Prudence is precisely concerned with deliberating well in domains where there is no craft. In other words, where there's no canonical template or recipe about how to achieve an end. So he says, we call people prudent about some restricted area when they calculate well about means to some excellent end in an area where there is no craft. So that's the prudent person. It doesn't always have to be thinking about how can I be good, how can I be virtuous. They can also be thinking about in a kind of troubleshooting way, in a kind of ad hoc way about areas where there isn't some kind of established craft. So they're good at thinking outside the box, as we say nowadays. That's the idea of prudence. Likewise, since Aristotle believes both action and production, insofar as they involve deliberation or rational calculation, rationally calculating thought, they both concern matters that could be otherwise. And demonstration, remember, is of things that could not be otherwise. Necessary things like mathematical truths. And so the prudent person won't be able to rely upon demonstration either. That is, the prudent person won't be able to rely upon the kind of recipes or templates that the craftsperson can use in production, but nor will the prudent person be able to rely upon demonstration. So he says, and the reason for this is because there are no unchanging things that the prudent person is concerned with, like the scientist, we might say, is. So in section 3, he says, now no one deliberates about things that cannot be otherwise, or about things that cannot be achieved in his action. Hence, if science involves demonstration, but there is no demonstration of anything whose principles admit of being otherwise, it follows that prudence is not science, nor yet craft knowledge. What the implications of this for Aristotle's attitude towards such things as moral principles or moral rules of conduct, or commandments, like the 10 Commandments? It's not initially clear. Does Aristotle believe that such moral principles as we find in the 10 Commandments, for example, are untrue? Why can't I demonstrate that I shouldn't cheat you by following a sort of proof like this? One shouldn't cheat one's neighbor. You are my neighbor. Therefore, I shouldn't cheat you. Why isn't that a demonstration? What would Aristotle say about that? Well, we have to sort of speculate here, but probably he would regard it as harmless, but also as useless. It's true by definition that cheating is wrong. However, in real life, the true test of the prudent person is to determine which cases are instances of cheating, which cases we should describe correctly, truly, as cheating. And here there will be no generally valid rules of the kind we find in scientific demonstrations. Is that cheating? I mean, in some cases there are clear cases and every prudent person would agree. In other cases you'd have to reason about whether that was cheating or not. So this little practical syllogism leading to the conclusion I shouldn't cheat you really isn't very useful in practical reasoning as it is engaged in concretely and particularly in everyday life. I think that's probably what Aristotle would say. So he defines prudence as follows. Section 4. The remaining possibility then is that prudence is a state grasping the truth, involving reason, concerned with action about things that are good or bad for a human being. That's prudence. A state grasping truth, involving reason, concerned with action about things that are good or bad for the human being. Notice in this definition, prudence is concerned with truth, once again. It aims at true judgments about what to do. As I've explained previously, for Aristotle, there are true and false judgments about what is acting finely and what is acting basely. There are true and false judgments about those things. And to possess the virtue of prudence is precisely to possess the truth about such matters. Also, unlike craft knowledge, prudence involves achieving its end in the action itself, not in some product outside the end, as craft knowledge does. Okay, this leads to the first discussion question. Is Aristotle correct in his apparent assumption that there are no demonstrations in the ethical domain? Do you see a use or necessity for providing formal demonstrations in support of ethical conclusions, analogous to a mathematical or logical demonstration? Why or why not? Does the absence of demonstrations imply that there can be no rationales or justifying reasons that can be given by the prudent person in support of his or her actions and ethical judgments? Again, why or why not? So this is the first discussion question. Is Aristotle correct in his apparent assumption that there are no demonstrations in the ethical domain? Do you see a use or necessity for providing formal demonstrations in support of ethical conclusions, analogous to mathematical or logical demonstrations? Why or why not? Does the absence of demonstrations imply that there can be no rationales or justifying reasons that can be given by the prudent person in support of his or her actions and ethical judgments? Again, why or why not? Okay. Next is understanding. Understanding grasps the principles that scientific knowledge relies on. He defines it roughly as follows. The definition is not as clear here, but understanding is something like the state in which we grasp the truth and never make mistakes about principles. Understanding is the state in which we grasp the truth and never make mistakes about principles. And the immediate question or puzzle that one might have in this regard is, why is this virtue distinct from scientific knowledge? Aristotle's account here is a bit sketchy, but he seems to mean something like this. Scientific knowledge involves demonstrations, which means the ability to connect universal principles to individual cases. But experience of humanity and human intellectual fallibility shows that it's possible to be very good in connecting and to reliably connect universal principles with individual cases, and yet not really understand the principle. Although, against this interpretation, one has to say that Aristotle does speak about knowing the principle when he talks about scientific knowledge. So it's a bit of a puzzle, but I think that's one fairly plausible idea, that it's one thing to be able to deduce things from principles. It's another thing to really understand the principle. And so understanding involves some kind of deeper appreciation of what scientific knowledge is actually getting you. Because you not only are able to connect the principle to the particular case, and the particular case to the principle, perhaps, if induction is included in that, but also you really understand, you really grasp the principle. I think in humanistic fields, including philosophy and theology, there's a danger of people being able to talk and even argue about these subject areas without really understanding their principles, because the principles are not necessarily translatable into experimental, that is, outputs. The principles aren't rigorously testable in any kind of rigorously defined way. Okay, so finally we come to wisdom. And wisdom, it turns out, is not anything new. It's not something we haven't seen before, but it's actually a combination of knowledge, scientific knowledge rather, and understanding. So that's all that wisdom is these two together. Scientific knowledge with understanding. And therefore, understanding Aristotle's conception of wisdom, I think, is going to be infected with the same kind of ambiguity or obscurity as our understanding of understanding, ironically. But at any rate, this is the view that wisdom is scientific knowledge with understanding. Section 3, page 107. Hence, the wise person must not only know what is derived from the principles of science, but also grasp the truth about the principles. Therefore, wisdom is understanding plus scientific knowledge. It is scientific knowledge of the most honorable things that has received understanding as its coping stone. Okay. Now, next in this chapter, Aristotle seems to contradict what he said in Book 1 about political science being the highest science. Instead, this honor is reserved for the science that studies the highest beings, which we know as metaphysics, what Aristotle called first philosophy. And if you haven't already and you want to get a taste of that, you can check out my playlist on Aristotle's metaphysics, which contains several, I think 8 or so videos on Aristotle's metaphysics. That's the highest science. So that's the domain of wisdom. That gives you a more concrete, filled out idea of what Aristotle would consider wisdom to consist in. If this definition isn't doing it for you. The implication is that wisdom is a higher virtue than prudence. Prudence only reasons about things that change, and about human beings only. Prudence involves deliberating about contingent things that may or may not come to be. Whereas wisdom reasons about things that don't change. God or the gods, the ultimate being, all of reality. It involves grasping truths, the truth, with a capital T, of the fundamental principles of reality, and being able to make and follow demonstrations from and to these principles. So even though some members of his culture and ours might have thought that to be wise is to be good at achieving happiness for oneself and the city, Aristotle appears to reject this conclusion. He says, page 107 at the bottom, "It is also evident that wisdom is not the same as political science. For if people are to say that science about what is beneficial to themselves as human beings counts as wisdom, there will be many types of wisdom corresponding to the different species of animals. For if there is no one medical science about all beings, there is no one science about the good for all animals, but a different science about each specific good. It does not matter if human beings are the best among the animals, for there are other beings of a far more divine nature than human beings. Most evidently, for instance, the beings composing the universe. What we have said makes it clear that wisdom is both scientific knowledge and understanding about the things that are by nature most honorable. This is why people say Anaxagoras or Thales or that sort of person is wise but not prudent, whenever they see that he is ignorant of what benefits himself. And so they say that what he knows is extraordinary, amazing, difficult, and divine, but useless, because it is not human goods that he looks for. So there's first of all, an argument here that wisdom can't consist in the good for any particular species, not even human beings, because wisdom has to concern sort of the ultimate knowledge. That's part of the concept of wisdom, he seems to be implying here. And what's good for some particular species of biological organism is clearly not ultimate knowledge. It's clearly just a small niche area of knowledge. And we want, as it were, the absolute knowledge. And that's going to be knowledge of these divine things, the fundamental constituents of the universe and so forth. That seems to be his idea here. And so there's a sharp divide between wisdom and prudence, because prudence is just concerned with the good for human beings, whereas wisdom has a much, much broader scope. Okay, this leads to our second discussion question. Do you agree with Aristotle's view of wisdom? How do you conceive of what true wisdom consists of? Does Aristotle draw too sharp a line between wisdom and prudence? How would you describe the relationship between wisdom and prudence? So, second discussion question. Do you agree with Aristotle's view of wisdom? How do you conceive of what true wisdom consists of? Does Aristotle draw too sharp a line between wisdom and prudence? How would you describe the relationship between wisdom and prudence? So he's going to have more to say about that, actually a little later. So you might want to keep your powder dry, in particular about that last one, about the relationship between wisdom and prudence. In chapter 8, Aristotle distinguishes between different kinds of prudence. So you have legislative science, concerned with prudently writing good laws. You have political science, concerned with governing the city and managing its affairs intelligently. And then you have prudence in the narrow sense, which concerns the individual's management of his own affairs. Aristotle points out that it's possible to possess one of these forms of prudence without possessing the other. Also, he makes the point that because prudence concerns particulars rather than universal principles, it depends upon experience. And this is why young people are so often imprudent. They lack experience. All right, so now we have a series of a few minor virtues, which seem to be sort of actually subsets of prudence in a certain way. The first is good deliberation. Because it's tied to particulars, and it cannot be reduced to following general principles, it can be difficult to get a clear grasp of what good deliberation is, and this can be frustrating. It's easier to say what good deliberation is not rather than what it is. It's not scientific demonstration. It's not really good guessing. It's not any kind of belief, just believing something to be the case, or faith. Aristotle insists that correctness belongs to deliberation. One can indeed be correct and incorrect, potentially, about one's deliberations. It's subject to that norm of correctness. So that's one feature of deliberation. But it's difficult to say what this correctness consists in. Deliberation is the sort of rational calculation or a reasoning out of the means to the end. Hence, it's tempting to conclude that correct deliberation will be simply a matter of effectiveness in achieving one's ends. But that will be true only if we construe effectiveness very widely to include fineness within the scope of the ends of correct deliberation. So he says, page 111 there, the second half of section 4. Since there are several types of correctness, clearly good deliberation will not be every type. For the incontinent or base person will use rational calculation to reach what he proposes to see, and so will have deliberated correctly, but will have got himself a great evil. Having deliberated well, however, seems to be a sort of good, for the sort of correctness in deliberation that makes a good deliberation is the sort that reaches a good. There's a terminological issue here, because he even seems to say that you can deliberate correctly if you're a vicious person. But actually, later on, Aristotle will make a distinction between prudence and what he calls cleverness, which I think is what he's thinking of here. So if it's not concerned with the fineness of the means as well as the achievement of the end, then deliberation is not a part of prudence. It's merely what Aristotle calls cleverness, merely being clever at figuring out how to get what you want. But that's not good deliberation for Aristotle. In the end, Aristotle settles on a definition of good deliberation that may perhaps be unavoidably vague. He says, good deliberation is correctness that accords with what is beneficial about the right thing in the right way and at the right time. That's section 6. And that doesn't seem perhaps to be all that informative, but it may be that this is just part of the nature of the beast, that the only thing one can do is to provide detailed examples of good deliberation to illustrate what's meant by this notion. But unfortunately, again, this is not something that Aristotle doesn't do. But that doesn't mean it's not possible to do. Okay, more briefly, he discusses this thing called comprehension, which is a minor, previously unmentioned virtue of thought that seems to involve the ability to judge whether or not someone's actions were prudent, someone else's actions were prudent, as opposed to deciding what to do in one's own case. That's comprehension, sort of understanding what the rationale was behind why did you do that? Was your action prudent or not when you're evaluating someone else? In chapter 11, Aristotle introduces another minor, previously unmentioned virtue of thought, which he calls consideration. And this, we might say, is the virtue of the decent person, referencing the discussion of decency from the previous video. It seems to go together with comprehension to make one into a sensitive person, we might say today. Aristotle notes here that people seem to vary naturally in these virtues. And he explains this by saying, well, they're tied to perceptive ability, which has natural variations among people. Today, I think we might say that some people are naturally more empathetic than others. They have a high, empathy IQ, or however that's referred to. Okay. In chapter 12, Aristotle quite explicitly states that prudence is inferior to wisdom. That prudence is inferior to wisdom. And he says this implies that it would be absurd for prudence to control wisdom. And clearly the implication is that wisdom must control prudence. That we might say the target of prudence must, in some sense, come from wisdom. So that's, of course, still a little vague at this point, but that lays down the hierarchical relationship that Aristotle sees, evidently, between wisdom and prudence. This doesn't mean that prudence, and by extension the virtues of character, are good only in a qualified way. By qualified, he would mean that it's good merely as an instrument to achieve some end. The relationship between prudence and wisdom is more complex than that, more difficult than that. And he lays this out in 3 propositions in sections 4 through 6, page 114. First of all, let us state that both prudence and wisdom must be choiceworthy in themselves. Both prudence and wisdom must be choiceworthy in themselves, even if neither produces anything at all, for each is the virtue of one of the 2 rational parts of the soul. Second, they do produce something. Wisdom produces happiness, not in the way that medical science produces health, but in the way health produces health. For since wisdom is a part of virtue as a whole, it makes us happy because it is a state that we possess and activate. Further, we fulfill our function insofar as we have prudence and virtue of character. For virtue makes the goal correct, and prudence makes the means to it correct. So, here's some takeaways from this. What he seems to be saying is, first of all, that prudence and wisdom, we'll abbreviate these P and W, are both choice-worthy in themselves. It's not the case that just because wisdom controls prudence and sets the target for it, that therefore prudence is good only as a means to wisdom. It seems like you would resist that conclusion. So there's at least some sense in which they're both choice-worthy in themselves. But wisdom is intrinsically productive of happiness. And by intrinsic here, we mean, as he says, it's productive not in the way medicine is productive of health, but in the way health is productive of health. That is, I take that to mean it's intrinsically productive of happiness. That there's not wisdom over here and then it's producing this other thing over here that's happiness. But rather the happiness is intrinsic to wisdom. And then third, he says we fulfill our function through prudence and virtue of character. Okay, so those are the propositions. So how does all of this fit together? I mean, this is a perplexing question. I would say that what these propositions suggest is something like this, that when we pursue all the virtues together, these will all be aiming cooperatively at producing a life that achieves wisdom. The goal of life is the achievement of wisdom in a way that's enabled by the virtues of character and the other virtues of thought. So when we pursue all the virtues together, these are all together going to be aiming cooperatively at producing a life that achieves wisdom. But we'll have to leave that as a bit of a question mark at this point because Aristotle doesn't give us much more to go on at this point about this relationship between the virtues of character and the virtues of thought. And that's going to remain a kind of abiding question. Okay, well, I think we can leave it at that. There's one more chapter here where Aristotle considers some miscellaneous issues, but I think we can safely pass over that without commentary. So that'll do it for this video. Next time we'll begin on this topic of incontinence.